Good afternoon. Thank you so much to those of you who be with us today. I realized that my planning of the symposium was in thinking that students will still be on campus, and I didn't think about the fact that they would be taking finals. So I want to welcome you to the final component of our symposium today. And just as a housekeeping measure, there are email sign-up sheets in the back. If you have any interest in hearing more from Francis and Anna, they've invited you to sign up for the Small Planet Institute email list, and those are in the back. I want to start as the organizer of the symposium by thanking people because it's very important to acknowledge that this is not really something that came from me alone. I first want to thank the Department of Geography. I'm Dr. Lindsay Naylor from the Department of Geography, and the department has been very supportive of this endeavor, and also the College of Earth, Ocean, and Environment. The College of Arts and Sciences also sponsored this programming, and our leading co-sponsor is the Office for Graduate and Professional Education. One of the things that might not be visible from the public part of the symposium is that the people that were participating on the stage, for the most part, have been all working together over the last couple of days discussing our ideas about food systems change. And so I want to thank everyone who came and participated in that, and especially our graduate students who, in this busy time, came together to participate in that workshop. And I also just want to thank everybody for sharing their work and their ideas and their questions with us today. It's been a really rich space for discussion. The Community Voices workshop really helped generate some great ideas, and I said that I was feeling very energized, even though I probably should be feeling exhausted. Thank you very much to Keynote for his facilitation. Lastly, I want to thank all of the people behind the scenes who you're not seeing here today. Sandy Raymond and Casey Middlemass, the demi-goddesses of the geography department. Grace Savoy Burke for her workshop coordination this afternoon and her setup earlier. All of that wonderful question writing and setup of the paper came from her. Haley Stanko, who designed our logo and our website and has been tweeting at you all day. And finally, Nathan Thayer, who I don't think is in the audience because he's still doing work for me on the symposium, but who has made my job infinitely easier and decidedly more fun, and helped me keep my head on straight. Even further behind the scenes, I must take a moment to thank my partner, Joe Jasper, who kept me fed and watered during many weeks of planning this event, which for someone focused on food really shouldn't be a problem, but turns out it would have been impossible without him, so thank you very much. Thank you to you all. I also want to give a shout out to our moms because it's Mother's Day tomorrow. Again, really excellent planning skills on this part. You do the most important work on the planet, and I just want to acknowledge that and say that we are grateful for you. So I am actually up here not only to say thanks, but also to introduce our introducer, because that's what we do in academia. I am pleased to invite Dr. Matt Koncervic to the podium. Matt is our Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs here at the University of Delaware, but he's also a professor of English and is the author of a number of books, including Sex, Scandal, and Celebrity in late 18th century England. So more than this, though, he's active in the greater Newark community, and according to his sons, a great baker of bread. So I hope your sourdough starter is still kicking. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Matt Koncervic.
Welcome, everybody. It's been my pleasure to join you this afternoon for the symposium. I really learned a lot, and I'm taking a lot away from it. I just want to take a moment and thank Lindsay for pulling it together. So join me in a round of applause for Lindsay Naylor. Lindsay's a great scholar and somebody who really is committed to having an impact beyond just the classroom. This week, we had a faculty senate meeting, and there was a resolution introduced by Lindsay and some of her colleagues for consideration in the faculty senate that calls for the university to do two things. Did this come up earlier today or not? Yeah. Okay, so two things. One, find ways to encourage the production and distribution of student-grown organic food within the university's own food system, including its dining halls, farmers market, and a possible future on-campus food bank. And two, encourage the developers and builders of our Star campus, this big 272-acre patch of land that we're investing in the university's future growth. Encourage the developers, perhaps with faculty and student experts from our agriculture college, to plant large numbers of ecologically beneficial native trees and plants rather than the exotic, non-native, and ecologically useless species that dominate traditional horticultural planting. So I think this is great. But resolutions like this, I think, are the latest example of how UD's community engagement initiative is catalyzing efforts to connect our campus and our activities to the community around us and to rethink our own community here on campus. This initiative was launched a few years ago. We earned the Carnegie classification as an engaged university, and so there's been a lot of talk about engagement and a lot of activity. This is, I think, just the most recent example around healthy communities, but also arts and culture and education. There have been a lot of initiatives coming out of the university engagement initiative. The Healthy Communities Initiative was one launched last fall, and it's working to improve health and well-being among Delaware residents and across the nation, particularly those in socially and economically disadvantaged communities. The partnership is primarily sponsored by the College of Arts and Sciences, the College of Health Sciences, and our Agriculture College, but the goal is ultimately to involve all 7 colleges and undergraduate, graduate students, and faculty in this effort. What I find exciting about UD right now is that things like this are happening at the same time that we're developing greater institutional investments in research and in graduate education. Our community engagement activities are happening at the same time that we're developing a graduate college. So this symposium is sponsored by the Office of Graduate and Professional Education, and the proposal is to develop a graduate college, centralize and really lift up efforts that support faculty research and graduate students on campus, give it greater prominence, give it greater direction. And that Faculty Senate resolution that I just referred to that Lindsay had helped to co-sponsor was considered right after the Senate endorsed the establishment of a graduate college. So I think it's great that at a research university, we're committing ourselves to both of these kinds of things, right? That engagement isn't the enemy of research. They go hand in hand. Our engaged activities should be knowledge-based, and the product of our community engagement efforts should be disseminated in scholarship. That's really the model that we want to pursue. And I think our country, and indeed the world, needs schools like UD to be doing this now more than ever. As research and development, basic research has been abandoned by corporations in favor of return on investment for investors. It is up to universities to be carrying on basic research and increasingly helping to translate that into applications in the world. It's not a new idea. It's as old as the Morrill Land Grant Acts themselves, but I think it's newly important. And events like today's symposium, I think, are among the ways that we show our commitment to our community. So I'm glad that you're here to participate in this work. So I have the pleasure also of introducing tonight's keynote speakers, Frances Moore Lappé and her daughter Anna Lappé. Frances is the author or co-author of something on the order of 19 books, I believe, about world hunger, living democracy, which is something we talked a lot about in the workshop, and the environment. She is the author of Diet for a Small Planet, a best-selling and vastly influential book published in 1971. I was curious about the world of food in 1971, and I did a little bit of research on my supercomputer. 1971 is the year that McDonald's introduced the Quarter Pounder. And it's also, I know, that's like a dagger, right? And it's also the year that the first Starbucks opened in Seattle. So this was a good year for this book to come out. This is important, right? And the work you've done since, I think is really important. That book was inspired by, I forget her first name, Ellen Ewald, is that her name? Who then, who contributed ideas for recipes to the book, and then who followed it up with a 1973 book, Recipes for a Small Planet, which is the favorite cookbook of our provost, Robin Morgan, who highly recommends complimentary pie. She tells me it's a savory bean and rice dish, so. Frances's contributions to our collective awareness about food systems, environmental security, and social justice has earned her many accolades over the years. I mean, there really are too many to enumerate, but I'll just focus on the year 2008. That was a particularly good year. She received the James Beard Foundation Humanitarian of the Year Award for her lifelong impact on the way people all over the world think about food, nutrition, and agriculture. And in that same year, Gourmet Magazine named her among 25 people whose work has changed the way America eats. Joining her on that list are people like Thomas Jefferson, Upton Sinclair, and Julia Child. So not bad company to be in. That's pretty exciting. She's the co-founder of 3 organizations, including the Oakland-based think tank Food First, and more recently the Small Planet Institute in Cambridge, Mass., which she leads with her daughter, Anna. Frances and Anna have also co-founded the Small Planet Fund, which supports democratic social movements worldwide, and 2 of which have won Nobel Prizes since the founding in 2002. Anna is a national best-selling author, also respected advocate for sustainability and justice along the food chain, and an advisor to funders investing in food system transformation. Again, something we talked a lot about this afternoon. Her books include Diet for a Hot Planet, The Climate Crisis at the End of Your Fork and What You Can Do About It, which was named by Booklist and Kirkus as one of the best environmental books of the year. And Grub, Ideas for an Urban Organic Kitchen, showcasing the ecological and social benefits of sustainable food. Her work has been translated internationally and featured in publications from the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Guardian, the Wall Street Journal, and as I was compiling this list, I thought the Guardian and the Wall Street Journal, probably not the same piece, but maybe, I don't know. That's a pretty good range. She currently helps to lead Real Food Media, based at Corporate Accountability International, which she founded to bring together leading food and farm organizations to produce powerful communications initiatives to inspire, educate, and grow the movement for sustainable food and farming. And as we know, you can have the best ideas in the world, but if you don't communicate them meaningfully and motivate action, they don't do anything. So that's crucially important. Her writing and advocacy have earned her also numerous accolades, such as the James Beard Foundation Leadership Award and the Compassion in Action Award from the Missing Peace Project. She's also been featured as a food fighter in the New York Times, which I'm not sure what that is, but that's a great title. We're fortunate to have both Frances and Anna Lappé as our keynote speakers this evening, so please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Well, thank you all so much for being here, and a special thank you to Dr. Lindsay Naylor. And I have to say that it's particularly special for me because, as she did mention, it is Mother's Day this weekend. And because of this event, I'm actually getting to spend Mother's Day with my mother. So it's really a delight to be here. And we'll be sort of going back and forth between us. And we got to spend some time with all of you today, and so I feel very much like what you'll hear tonight is kind of picking up on some of the conversations that you all have been having together and talking about what are these connections between power, democracy, and food, and what we really see as some of the underlying driving forces behind what we see as these interconnected crises: hunger, inequality, the erosion of democracy. We don't see these as separate, we see them as very connected, and you'll hear us talk about that tonight. And I will say what we plan to talk about will be very solutions focused, but it takes us a little while to get there to the solutions part, so just know it's coming. Hold on to your seats. And since we are a mother-daughter duo and we have rare opportunities to come together these days to talk together, I thought I would show a family snapshot. That is me when I was 5, I think, with my older brother, Anthony. And as you might be able to tell, this is not Disneyland. This is where my mother thought it would be fun to take us on what she called vacations. This is Guatemala, where we went on a research trip with her where she was studying land reform. This was very typical of the vacations we took with my mother. We went, I remember one of the most vivid trips we ever took together was meeting with farm worker organizers in Ohio. And I have to say, this childhood was really all right by me. I really enjoyed being brought into her work at a really early age. And as you can see now, 40 years later, I still very much enjoy being connected to this work. And I will say, one of the questions, we've been working together in various ways now for almost 2 decades. And one of the questions I get asked more than any other about this work is, and often when people ask me this question, they kind of whisper it kind of a little sheepishly, but they say, Anna, did you ever feel the need to rebel? And I don't know about all of you, but I feel like there is a heck of a lot of things to rebel against today. I really don't need to be rebelling against the politics of my mother. So that's how I would answer that question. And I also feel like that question gets at of how we think about social change and how do you make social change. And that for us, we really see the change that we're talking about that is so needed today is by definition so big and so transformational. It is multi-generational, and that it needs the young people, it needs the no BS teenagers from Parkland and young Black Lives Matter activists, and it needs the folks that have been doing the work for generations and for sometimes half a century. So it needs all of us working together.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Lindsay, and all of you who've organized this magnificent day. I am delighted to be here. So, I thought I would begin where I began. So here I am. Here I am, right? I'm a little bit lost in my mid-20s. What am I going to do with my life? And I had the best idea ever. I said, food, food, food. Everybody's got to eat. If I could just understand why is there hunger in the world, I would see a way through all the complexities and mysteries of economics and politics. So that was my first good idea, I think. And what was happening at that time was that the experts, the newspaper headlines, were all scaring us to death. They said, famine is around the corner. We've hit the limits of the capacity of the earth to feed us. So I went to the library and I said, is that right? Have we really hit the limits of the earth to feed us? And guess what I discovered? Literally kind of putting two and two together. Actually, with my dad's slide rule, I did a little bit more than that. I know most of you don't know what a slide rule is, but it was kind of nice. I learned that, in fact, the experts in the newspapers were wrong, that there was more than enough for us all. And that discovery is what set me on then this lifetime of questions. And by the 1990s, my question had grown and grown and grown into this one. This is so far the biggest question that I can think of. Why are we together creating a world that we as individuals would never choose? In other words, I don't know many people who get up, turn off the alarm, and then say, yeah, how can I make another child die of hunger today? Or get up, wipe their eyes, oh, how can I heat the planet and decimate species? I don't think that's what we do. So how do we make sense of this? How do we understand that this bright, bright species is actually creating a world that we as individuals would not choose? And so I puzzled over that for a really long time, because I don't think it's about fixed human nature or just ignorance of the facts. What is it? And so I asked, what's really special about human beings? And the most special thing about us is the power of our minds. I here love to quote Aldous Huxley, all that we are and will and do depends in the last analysis on what we believe the nature of things to be. The power of ideas, that we see the world through a certain mindset. And in the 13th century poet Rumi said it even better, I think, and simpler. He said, we rarely hear the inward music, but we're all dancing to it nevertheless. And so I wanted to understand what Huxley was saying. What is the mindset? What are the bars of that music that we're dancing to, but we can't really see? And so I've come to see that you and I are alive. This is my thesis. You and I are alive when the dominant mindset that literally determines what we can see and what we cannot see is really putting us in big danger. But I want to, before I go into that, just bring it real home with a really personal example. And it happened to me a few Thanksgivings ago. I got up in the morning really excited about making my root vegetable dish. And I always make it in the same pot. And 35 people are coming that afternoon. I want to get to going on it. So I rush down to the kitchen. I look in all the cupboards and wait, it's not there. It's not there. Where is it? And I went to the basement and I started getting really angry. Did somebody borrow it and not even tell me? I couldn't find my pot. So I just started chopping vegetables. 20 minutes later, I turn around and guess what? There it is. Except it had a plant in it. You get it? I was looking, I don't usually put plants in the oven, right? And so even though, you'll see, it's big and red, I couldn't see it because I wasn't looking for a planter. And so this is my way of explaining the power of our mindset. We see what we expect to see and not what is outside that filter. And so I've come to say that, we hear this refrain, seeing is believing. But I've turned it around. Honestly, I think this describes our predicament. Believing is seeing. And so we have to examine then, what are the beliefs that make up the mindset? And so I began, to hint that I think the dominant mindset is really dangerous. Why is it dangerous? Because I'm claiming it is actually not just poorly aligned, but perversely aligned with our nature and with human nature. And I know that's a really big claim, and I'm going to try to make it very clear very quickly. So I call this perverse mental map through which we've come to see the world, many of us, and certainly in our culture, most of us. I call it scarcity mind, and that harkens back to that aha moment I had when all the experts were telling us, we've run out. I think that frame of lack is very, very deep. And I've captured it in 3 S's, so I can remember, right? 3 S's. The idea that scarcity mind believes that we're all separate from one another, basically alone in this world, that the nature of life is stasis, things are pretty static, human nature static, our capitalist economic system, that's here to stay, nothing we can do much. And then, of course, the premise of all, there's not enough of anything. There's not enough of goods, of energy and food, and there's not enough goodness in us either. So it's fundamental, a frame of absolute lack. And from this scarcity mindset, we begin what I call a downward spiral of powerlessness. And that's where its real danger lies, because the assumptions built into this mindset take away our power. And here's how I see it, just really quickly. That if we start with a premise of lack of goods and goodness, if we see that we think we're only these selfish little competitive materialists, then of course we can't trust ourselves and we can't trust our neighbors to come together and deliberate over our future toward the general welfare, which actually the preamble to our Constitution calls us to, for the good of all. No, that's not within us. If we don't trust our capacities to do democracy, then it's really easy for us to fall for a big solution that takes us off the hook. And Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, President Reagan told us there is something that will work without us, right? We can turn over our fate to an infallible force he called the magic of the marketplace. Magic, we don't want to look behind the curtain, that ruins the fun, so we go along. Now, this magic of the marketplace, a lot of people call it the free market, as if it operates without rules and we're all fair participants. Well, actually, there is no such thing as a free market in that sense. Every human institution has rules and norms that set its course. And my claim is that our big rule, the big driver of this so-called free market that's not, is this. Do what brings highest return to existing wealth. That's the fundamental driver. And so then, it should not surprise us at all that wealth accrues to wealth and accrues to wealth until we reach this almost unfathomable inequality. That today in the US, 3 Americans control more wealth than the bottom half of the population. There's a study done that's been quoted in business journals and also, so it's pretty solid. 8 people worldwide control as much wealth as 3.6 billion people. So it's almost even hard to get our head around where this driver of this infallible market has taken us. And so here we are. But this spiral then is self-reinforcing, because once we then give away our power to this infallible automatic magical market, then wealth accrues such that then it's powerful enough, as now we see everywhere, for wealth to infect and infuse its interest into our political decision making and begin to then create what many people now call the rigged system, the swamp, whatever you want to call it. It is now such that Americans' distrust of government is at its worst. So I'm saying then that of course we can't trust a government that's driven by a tiny minority, and power inequalities increase, economic inequalities increase, and then what happens? We see all this homelessness on streets everywhere, and we see billionaires raking in even more, and then we say, oh, see, we really are these grubby, selfish individualists out for our own, get it? And so our sense of ourselves goes deeper, and the spiral quickens. So that's the spiral of disempowerment that is so dangerous today. And so my punchline really in this is that then it really creates the very conditions that we know now bring out the very worst in us. Concentrated power, secrecy in public affairs, and a culture of blame. And so what happens then, and we bring it now back to food and hunger, what happens then is that we end up with this plenty of food in the world, 2,900 calories per day for every man, woman, and child on earth. That's enough to make us all pretty chubby. And yet, 1 in 4 of our children in the world is stunted. Now, stunting is not just meaning that you're short. It means that you are afflicted by a condition that can affect you throughout your entire life. And on the number of people hungry, it has just gone up again to 815 million, and this is a very conservative way of measuring hunger. And even though food production continues to increase. So this then is where we are. Through the scarcity mind, this is what I've come to see, that we actually end up creating scarcity, the experience of scarcity, no matter how much we produce.
Okay, so my task now is to talk about how we're creating this scarcity that we say we fear, that we don't want. How are we seeing that? How are we creating that in our global food systems and in our food system here in the United States? And so when we think about what have been some of the trends in our food system since World War II, we've seen the spread of what's known as industrial agriculture in the United States and also increasingly around the world. And it's a mode of agriculture, a mode of food systems that's heavily dependent on chemical pesticides, synthetic fertilizer, drugs. There's 450 different drugs that have been permitted to be used now in livestock production, including antibiotics. It's a way of farming that's really defined by huge, vast acreage of monoculture crops, or growing one kind of crop over large fields. It's also defined by concentrated animal feeding operations, otherwise known as CAFOs or factory farms. And this production system that's expanded since World War II has really been enabled by and flourished because of political systems that have been captured by those who are profiting from this system. The industries that profit from this system that have helped to loosen the regulation around how we govern our food and farming systems, so that the industries that are at the heart of this industrial model, which include the pharmaceutical industry, the oil and gas industries, the agribusiness traders, processed food companies, that all of these companies are not paying the real price for how they're producing the food, and they're not paying that price for creating the scarcity that none of us want. So how is this scarcity being actively created? I'm going to go through a couple of different examples. Probably many of you, from meeting many of you today, many of you are very familiar with these, but I'm just going to knock through them to emphasize how we're creating the scarcity that my mother has been talking about for decades. So first, this industrial model that's heavily dependent on synthetic fertilizer that shifts us away from building soil fertility through crop rotations or all kinds of natural ways, it creates a system that is hugely dependent on our energy sector. So synthetic fertilizer, to create synthetic fertilizer takes tons of energy, either from natural fracked gas or from coal-fired power plants, so effectively creating scarcity in energy markets. We're seeing an industrial model also that's hugely dependent on water. This way of farming, it destroys soil health. When I talk to farmers who have transitioned to more sustainable ways of farming, they say one of the best things about transitioning is that their soils are healthier and able to withstand flooding events, but also capture and store water that otherwise would be lost to the farms. So we're seeing in our Midwest today, industrial farms using huge amounts of water. The main source of water in agriculture in the Midwest is known as the Ogallala Aquifer. 90% of the water coming out of that aquifer is being used for crop irrigation. And you should think of aquifers as geologic water. Once it's gone pretty much forever. It'll take about 6,000 years to be replaced naturally. And we are creating that water scarcity by a food system that demands so much water. Third, we're seeing this incredible use of pesticides and fertilizer in our farm fields. It means lots of runoff into our waterways, which of course creates scarcities in fisheries. Perhaps the most extreme example of this is the agricultural runoff from our farm fields in the US, but also globally, are creating what are known as dead zones, which many of you are probably familiar with. There are now 400 of these dead zones around the world. They're created by agricultural runoff that creates algal blooms that essentially suck up all the oxygen and make the water incompatible with aquatic life. The dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that's caused by our agricultural runoff here, I just read recently, it was the largest it's ever been last year. It grew to the size of New Jersey. So talk about creation of scarcity. We also see this industrial livestock operation squander resources in other ways, particularly in how much land is being used to raise crops for livestock. My mother's been talking about this for decades, that today about half of all the grain and soy produced in the world is not going to feed us humans directly. It's going either into the bellies of livestock or the bellies of cars in the form of biofuels, or it's going to industrial products. In fact, cattle production alone uses 3/5 of the world's agricultural land between grazing and crop production, but only gives back to us 5% of humanity's calories. So to again, talk about how we're creating this food system that should be and can be producing abundance and instead really creating scarcity. One of the other ways that we're creating scarcity that I find particularly alarming is the use I mentioned earlier of drugs in factory farms, particularly antibiotics. Probably many of you are familiar with the statistic that about 3/4 or more of all antibiotics used now in this country are not used for our human health. They are used in animal livestock operations. And importantly, they are being used so much in these factory farms, not just to prevent disease, that's part of it, but they were really captured the minds of livestock producers because antibiotics have been found to promote growth at faster rates and more cheaply than traditional feed. So these subtherapeutic levels of antibiotics have now been used for decades in livestock operations. Meanwhile, the public health community for decades has been waving the red flag saying, we've got to get antibiotics out of meat production to be able to ensure that they keep working for humans and that we don't have antibiotic-resistant bacteria that is creating a public health epidemic around the country and around the world. So again, we're sort of creating this scarcity of this vital public health resource in the way we're designing our food system. And the last and final example of scarcity creation you can see here in this image, this is from palm oil operations in Indonesia, is the way that commodity producers are increasingly encroaching on some of the most vital carbon-rich land on the globe, in Brazil, in Indonesia, and as a result, putting food systems on the map as one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. Globally, food systems are now responsible for about 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. But this food system that we're talking about, this kind of dominant industrial food system, it's not just creating scarcity in the ways I've described, the sort of natural resource scarcity, or in the case of antibiotics, the scarcity of this public health resource. It's also creating scarcity in health as well. Because what have we seen this model producing in this post-World War II period? We've seen this industrial model producing industrial food. As one of my colleagues likes to call it, it's the standard American diet, or SAD. And it is quite sad. I mean, actually, maybe this isn't quite the best image because something about those donuts are kind of appealing to me right now. But the idea is that what we're producing out of the system, so look, if we were creating all this scarcity, but we were thriving as a species because the food was making us so healthy, maybe we would say that's a trade-off we have to take. But instead, this model is creating the processed foods, the high fat, high salt, high sugar, highly processed meats diet that's having incredible ramifications on our health. So a recent study just found that half of all deaths coming from heart disease, stroke, and diabetes were hastened because of unhealthy food, either eating too much of the stuff that's bad for us, or because this dominant food system has taken over so much farmland that, you know what they call it at the USDA, the fruits and vegetable production? They call that specialty crops. When instead, that should be the center of what we're eating. Now, of course, this model produces a scarcity of health and well-being that exacerbates, as well as, we would argue, creates inequality and impacts those at the heart of the food system the most. So a study in the late 1990s tried to look at the life expectancy, average life expectancy of farm workers, who are really at the heart of our food system. They found that the average life expectancy was 49 years old. That's on par with Somalia and Cote d'Ivoire. And here in this image of California, you would just have to go about 15 miles west, away from the center of farm worker country, to a wealthy neighborhood in California where the average life expectancy is several decades older. We're also seeing that these health impacts and the sort of scarcity of well-being, it's not being borne by all of us equally. People of color are disproportionately burdened by diet-related illnesses from this industrial food system. We can see that today, 1 in 2 African American and Hispanic children are at risk of developing type 2 diabetes at some point in their lifetime. 1 in 2. I mean, we used to call type 2 diabetes adult onset because it was adults who got it. And now, thanks to, anybody recognize the logo there? Thanks to Coca-Cola and this junk food diet, now children are getting type 2 diabetes at rates we've never seen before. And we're seeing those who are at the heart of our food system, as I said, the most impacted. So the Food Chain Workers Alliance, a group I work very closely with, did a study of food chain workers and found that more than half of all fast food workers have to rely on government assistance just to get food on their table. Because corporations are not paying fair wages, we taxpayers are essentially subsidizing them with our own dollars. So we've seen how food system impacts our well-being and the environment in all these ways as power over the food system has concentrated during the same period as well. So we're seeing over the past 50, 60 years, and in concentration in ownership in all sectors of food. We're seeing it in grain trading, in seeds, in chemicals, in the meat industry. And economists will tell you that once you have 4 or fewer corporations controlling 40% or more of a marketplace, you don't have true competitiveness. They'll tell you that consolidated power, like you see here in the meat industry, that it distorts markets. Innovation gets tamped down. Consumers lose choices. Farmers who rely on corporate intermediaries feel the pinch. And what's more, when you have the kind of consolidation that we have seen over the past 50 or 60 years in food, what's more is this concentration affects the political will to put in place the kinds of regulations that we would need to make those profiting from this industrial model pay the real price for creating the scarcities that they are creating. Consolidated power, it distorts markets and it distorts democracy. My mom and I were just looking at the numbers and we renewed our own level of shock around this, that agribusiness consistently uses its economic power to wield political power. We looked at just lobbying alone, and of course we know industries affect our politics in many ways beyond lobbying, but lobbying alone, agribusiness has spent nearly $500 million in the past 5 years to influence the way our government is run. And we were particularly shocked to see that in 2017, agribusiness, officially registered agribusiness lobbyists, I should say, outnumbered members of Congress by more than 2 to 1. So I've always loved this statement, that there is not a single grain of anything in the world sold in the free market. Remember that mythic free market that my mom talked about Ronald Reagan conjuring up in the public consciousness? But there isn't a single grain of anything in the world sold in a free market, not one. The only place you see a free market is in the speeches of politicians. I've loved this quote ever since I first read it. Guess who? Anybody want to take a guess of who said it? I'll give you a hint. It's not my mother. Any guesses?
Bernie Sanders.
Not Bernie Sanders either. It's this guy, somebody who should know, the former CEO of one of the largest grain trading companies in the world that was caught multiple times for collusion with his so-called competitors.
Thank you, Anna. I love that too, I have to say. So here I am again, back at the circles, back at the spirals. So as you now understand, I see all of these horrors that Anna has just laid out for us as in some ways very much a direct consequence of this, starting with lack, the spiral of disempowerment. And here we start on the good news. The good news is that I've lived long enough to see a rising and actually a life-enhancing, evidence-based, science-based way of seeing that I believe pays a big debt to the science of ecology itself. It is a relational worldview that I love to call EcoMind. And it is a spiral of empowerment. And that is really the key here. The EcoMind then has, instead of the S's of scarcity and separateness and all of that, the EcoMind is evidence-based in the sense that we now know that yes, we are all connected. Everything in life is connected. Everything we do makes changes in the network that we're part of. The only thing we can count on is continuous change. And if you take those two together, then we are all co-creators, that this EcoMind, it's not fixed, it's not some infallible law. Actually, we are co-creating our world moment to moment. And so I find this incredibly empowering. And its big lesson for me, this relational worldview, this EcoMind, thinking like an ecosystem, is the recognition that we humans are just like every other organism in this complex ecology, the social and natural ecology, and we're all therefore shaped by our context. That whether the best of us or the worst in us comes out depends incredibly on what are the social conditions that we ourselves are creating. That was my big aha as I wrote EcoMind. And so, what are the big lessons here about what are the conditions that bring out the best in us and the worst, right? I've suggested some of that. I'm going to go further into it. But first, I just want to pause for a second to underscore what I think is now pretty well founded, evidence-based. What are the pro-social qualities that most human beings have that are right there for us to bring forth to build real democracy? And one of them is that we enjoy cooperation. We are so evolved for cooperation that when scientists look at our brains, with the MRI scans, they see that actually we enjoy cooperating so much it's almost like we experience it like eating chocolate, right? Seriously. We also come equipped with a deep sense of fairness. And in that, we're not the only species, but we are the most cooperative primate, I will say that. But on fairness, there are a lot of, did you know that capuchin monkeys will actually throw back a ration, something they've gotten from their caretaker. If they see their buddy in the next cage had gotten a much better one, they will throw it back and say, that's not fair. Not really, but that's the idea. I mean, they don't say that, but you get the idea. So the point is we come equipped with a deep sense of fairness, with capacity for cooperation. And we also know, and many studies confirm, that we do better. Actually, we come up with better answers when we work in diverse groups and listen to one another. So all of that means that, okay, we have it in us. Now, what are the conditions that bring forth those qualities in us that are so central to real democracy and answering the challenge that Anna lays out, brought to us by concentrated power? So I'm saying then that the EcoMind makes possible the reverse of the scarcity spiral. It makes possible, we don't have to believe that human beings are inherently good and that's who we are. No, just that we have the capacities to be participants in a democracy if the right conditions are met to bring those out. That we then, because of those that I just listed, we are capable of cooperating in deliberative problem solving. And so we begin to trust, yes, we can remove the undue power of money over our political system, like the Archer Daniels Mindlins and the Kochs in the world, that we can do this. And once with that confidence then, we begin to work, and I'm going to make the case at the end of our talk how this is really happening now, picking up, to create values, boundaries in which the market can work, standards that make sure that we can all participate in the market, enjoy its benefits, and not be controlled, having our democracy controlled by it. And so that then creates a virtuous spiral as we begin to gain more confidence in ourselves, as we begin to experience the thrill of democracy, as I love to call it. So that spiral then creates then the conditions of that I argue have been shown throughout history to bring forth the best in us. That is the dispersion of power so that we all have a voice, transparency in public affairs. We know that we don't do so well when secrecy is the norm, and mutual accountability where we all step up and say, look, if we're all connected, we're all implicated, right? And so therefore, we're all part of the solution, and we're not just pointing fingers at each other and blame, blame, blame. So those are the three conditions that a spiral of powerlessness begins to make possible. And that then is the real promise of this moment in time. And we're going to take it up from there and keep going on the positive.
Okay, so picking up from what my mom was just talking about, so how are we seeing people creating that spiral of empowerment in food systems transformation, really revealing that scarcity at the heart of our dominant food system and really starting to talk about how do we create real transformative change. And again, this is where we start talking about how we are so thrilled to be seeing these solutions emerging all around the country and really all around the world, where we are seeing people asking these fundamental questions about how do you build power, how do you embolden democracy, how do you support an emergence of a food system that doesn't promote scarcity but actually fosters abundance, that actually does this really radical thing of growing food that's good for people and the planet and for workers. How do we make that happen? And how do we make sure that our food systems aren't polluting waterways, not contributing to antibiotic resistance, or not contributing to the climate crisis, and that those industries that are doing such things actually are having to pay the real price for that damage. And so we're seeing this emergence, again, around the country and around the world, as folks are coming together for broad-based social change and thinking about how can movements be created to make this transformation happen. And what we see happening through social movements, and this isn't just within the food movements, it's across social movements, is that what movements do is they help all of us move from that sort of that middle circle of, well, what is politically realistic? They move us toward they move that circle to create more possibility, more political possibility. That movements build power and shift cultural norms to create transformational change. So if I was able to, physically move images on this slide, I would be moving that purple circle into the blue circle. That social movements are pushing us forward to actually realize and create more political possibility. So I want to want to give you a couple examples of how we're seeing this happen around the country. And frankly, the good news is that I could have chosen many other examples. So you'll see a few tonight, but there are many other examples of people doing this and all around the country. So one example I want to focus on, it's called the Good Food Purchasing Program. And raise your hand if you've heard of this before. You're a very savvy group, so, but only at 2. Okay, so awesome. Then you'll be learning something new, and the 2 of you might be learning more about this. So the Good Food Purchasing Program, you may or may not know that every year, public institutions around the country, so city parks department, city schools, jails, hospitals, spend $11 billion, that's with the B, $11 billion on food. That's our money, right? That's our taxpayer dollars going into food systems. And almost all of those purchasing decisions are based on one thing. You have to get multiple bids, and then what do? If you're a responsible procurement officer, you pick the cheapest, right? And you might think, well, it's our money, it's our taxpayer money, they should pick the cheapest. But if you're thinking systemically, and you remember anything that I said earlier in the talk, you would know that the cheap food is actually not cheap. Think about all the costs we pay, again, taxpayer dollars, on the healthcare costs associated with the fact that children are getting type 2 diabetes, the healthcare costs associated with the fact that many antibiotics simply don't work anymore, and I could go on and on and on. So, several years ago, community leaders in Los Angeles started asking, what would it look like to radically transform how procurement happens? So instead of procurement officers having to choose the cheapest bid, that they can actually make their procurement decisions based on shared values. The result was the Good Food Purchasing Program, and it's a policy that's grounded in 5 shared values: health, local economies, animal welfare, worker well-being, and the environment, and has an emphasis on supporting women-led and people of color-led businesses. The policy passed in Los Angeles in 2012, and we've already seen incredible impacts around it. So this policy incentivizes institutions to be looking through this sort of values lens on procurement decisions. And we've already seen incredible impacts in Los Angeles. The one that I'll sort of pull out from this, among many other impacts, is around this antibiotics piece you've heard me talk about before. So there's a multi-year chicken contract in the city of Los Angeles for the schools, about $70 million contract. But because, and it came up for renewal after this policy passed, because they had this policy in place, all of a sudden the school board started asking different questions to its chicken suppliers. They started asking about their supply chain. And one of those questions was, well, what about antibiotics? Are you using it? Are you using it responsibly? And Tyson, which is one of the largest poultry producers in the country, actually pulled their contract because they didn't want to answer all those questions. And the contract, that $70 million contract, went to a poultry provider that committed to not using any antibiotics in its production. In the wake of this decision, actually Tyson Foods announced that it would stop using antibiotics in its chicken products by 2017, which was last year. And according to my friends who are experts on this, they've actually made good on this promise. Now, was it because this movement in Los Angeles pushed for this? Well, sure, it wasn't just that one thing. Decades-long activism created this result, but that work in Los Angeles was part of shifting what was politically possible for a company like Tyson and pushed them and shifted that market. So we've seen this Good Food Purchasing Program emerge all around the country, and I would say, and I'll show you the expansion in a second, but I just want to say one more thing about it, which is that for me, part of what gets me so excited about it is that it is really about sort of all of the things my mom is talking about: mutual accountability, cooperation, that kind of what it means to come together and deliberate in a community about what we want. I'll never forget moderating a panel of Good Food Purchasing Program advocates in Los Angeles, and on my panel I had an animal rights activist, the CEO of the food distribution company for the city of Los Angeles, an organizer with the laborers union, the Teamsters, an environmental activist, and the head of the county public health department. And after this panel, I was like, oh, it's so great that you all get along so well, and this is so great. You work together for this policy. And they kind of looked at me like I was really not getting it. They said, Anna, no. Before this policy, we did not get along like this. But because of this policy, we came together to realize that we actually have shared interest here, and that by working together, we can see all of our individual interests move forward, and we can do that together. And it's been really exciting to see that kind of coalition building happening in all the places that are interested in this policy. So we've seen cities starting to get interested, like the Twin Cities. We've seen other districts adopt it, San Francisco and Oakland. Really excitingly, in 2017, we saw the Chicago Public Schools adopt the policy. So 2 of the 3 largest school districts in the country now have this policy. And by this year, we saw even more cities interested in adopting this program. Now, if all of these cities you see here were to pass the program, you'd be talking about a program that would be helping to influence $880 million a year in food purchasing, which I think is pretty cool. So another example I want to share with you, again, of this sort of how do we reclaim our democracy and how do we upend that kind of concentrated power over food policy. Another example I want to share is the sugary drinks tax campaigns. So we know from the we know from lots of data that the soda industry has a huge effect on our health, that sugary drinks are the single largest source of sugar in our diets, and that drinking just 1 sugary drink a day will increase your chance of developing diabetes by 26%. We also know that the soda industry disproportionately targets children of color, and that children of color are disproportionately impacted by sugary drinks. And so what we're seeing all around the country are communities coming together to fight for soda taxes as a tool to address all of these health disparities, but also to bring revenue into communities for people who are most impacted by not just sugary drinks, but that very sad standard American diet that I was talking about before. And so in 2014, we saw the first US city pass a sugary drinks tax, Berkeley, California. And what we saw in the debates around the sugary drinks tax campaign there, as well as every other city that has passed the policy, are folks really helping to shift the story about sugary drinks and about our diet. That, again, movements are helping to make what might have seemed politically impossible, possible. So before Berkeley, the soda industry had beat back every single attempt to pass a soda tax, 39 attempts, before Berkeley passed it. But a key to this political shift that started making this winning possible was helping people see the real impact of sodas on our communities and on the inequities of the soda industry and the inequities in soda industry marketing tactics and soda consumption, and how these taxes can really help bring revenue, as I said, to communities most impacted. So since Berkeley passed it, we've seen many other cities taking this on, most recently Seattle, and we are now seeing estimates of about $125 million a year potentially coming from just these cities, from the revenue from these sugary drinks taxes. And in many cases, who is determining where these dollars go in Berkeley and Oakland, for instance, is a community board of people who represent the citizens of the community trying to deliberate together about how to put this revenue to work in the ways that most benefit communities. So the other way that we make that sort of shift toward what is politically shifting, what's politically possible, and to bring forth the kind of food systems that we want, is through changing the story. So my mom talked earlier about that mindset, that mindset she had about her red pot, that it was a pot, not a planter, so she literally couldn't see it, or the dominant mindset that many of us still have about industrial agriculture, that it's efficient, that we don't see the scarcity that's frankly quite obvious if we didn't have those blinders of that mindset on. So another thing that movements are doing is really shifting the dominant narrative about food farming and the possible. And they might not have the billions of dollars that the food industry has to spend on marketing and information, messaging. Coca-Cola alone spends $6 billion a year marketing sugary drinks around the world. So will we on our side ever have those dollars? No, but it means that we really do need to work even more creatively. So and we do this work because we aren't just about trying to kind of get the information out to people. We're really trying to change the story, change the meaning that people hold in their hearts about food systems, for instance. It's something that we've been trying to do at Real Food Media, where we've been really trying to work with partners around the country to create really creative communications initiatives to help expose the real story of food, to help expose the truth about the scarcity of our industrial model, and to help lift up the stories that I'm sharing with you today of where we're seeing real solutions. The other way that we're seeing movements shape the story of food is by holding media institutions accountable. Getting media institutions to be held accountable, especially today, is not easy. But it's another way that social movement actors are really shaping the story. So a few months ago, The Atlantic magazine that hosts also live events, hosted an event about the future of food. And you might see in the smaller type that it was sponsored by Dow DuPont. Actually, on the website where this lived, you had to click to reveal the underwriter. So it was underwritten by Dow DuPont, which is the merged chemical company. You may be familiar with some of Dow DuPont's toxic legacy. You might be familiar with the fact that Dow was a producer of Agent Orange, the highly toxic herbicide that was used in Vietnam and still associated with really heartbreaking birth defects in that country, as well as incredible health impacts on veterans. You may be familiar that Dow bought Union Carbide, which was responsible for a tragic and totally preventable toxic incident in India when its plant had an accident that was caused because of cost-cutting measures by Union Carbide at the time that would have prevented the accident from happening. You may be familiar with DuPont for producing Teflon, a toxic substance that DuPont actually, we now know, knew was toxic for decades and kept it from the public and from regulators. So, call me a radical, but I do not think that Dow DuPont is necessarily the best arbiter for what the future of food should look like. And so what did social movement actors do? They reached out to The Atlantic magazine and they said, raised this question of how are you standing there as a media institution which should be holding the powerful to account, partnering with the powerful for an event on the future of food. When The Atlantic magazine did not drop its partnership with Dow DuPont, what people did was people actually all around the world, from Hawaii to India to the United States, captured their hashtag for the event, which was #AtlanticHarvest. And I have to admit, I got quite a lot of delight by watching their Twitter feed, just hundreds of tweets during their live event. Nothing, actually, there was maybe a handful of comments written by somebody paid by Atlantic to be tweeting. The rest were from activists. It's blurry here, you can't see it, but activists from India, from Bhopal Medical Appeal that have been trying to get restitution from the company for decades, activists from the Center for Environmental Health, folks in Hawaii who've been impacted by pesticides in Hawaii. So it was an example of folks trying to hold media to account and really transform what is the story of the future of food and who should really be telling it. And perhaps another one of the best ways we can shift the story of food is to give voice to those who are most impacted by the food system. So a great example of this is the Bigger Picture Project, which produces heartbreaking, gut-wrenching, fist-pump-inducing videos by young people who talk about the toll of sugar and sugary drinks on their lives and their communities. So we certainly have a long way to go and lots of work to do. And certainly what I heard from today was many of you engaging in this work. A lot of work to do to shift the power in the food system and bring democracy back in. But I will say that we are seeing attitudes changing and markets shifting. I was pleased to see a couple years ago this special report in Fortune magazine that found that 25 of the top 25 U.S. food and beverage companies that producing that sad food I talked about earlier, that those companies have lost an equivalent of $18 billion in market share since 2009, as more people have been really demanding and pushing for and shifting the markets for food that more reflects our shared common values. And I particularly like this one quote from this report where they said, of the nation's biggest food companies, I would think of them like melting icebergs. Every year, they become a little less relevant.
I love Anna's examples of what I was trying to describe in that spiral of empowerment that was all about people becoming empowered. And so I want to wrap it up and close this out with that theme of that, in fact, I do believe for the first time, maybe in history, certainly in my lifetime, there is something very, very powerful underway, of which the food movement is absolute key, and all the elements that Anna was describing. And so I want to take you back 2 years to April 2016, and that was a life-changing moment for me as I began to wake up to this new reality that I find so incredibly full of possibility and power. I marched with Democracy Spring from Philadelphia to Washington, and guess what? It wasn't just about an individual issue. It was people waking up and saying, oh, whether it's food, whether it's mass incarceration, whether it's gender equity, whatever my passion is, I know that I really have to have genuine democracy, accountable to citizens, to take it all the way home. And so we came together and we marched together. And there we are, if that's my mouth open above the letter D, and, E. And my favorite chant was, whose democracy? Our democracy. Whose democracy? Our democracy. And we were engaging in rallies and cheat-ins, and perhaps the largest civil disobedience on the Capitol steps, certainly in recent history, and nobody really knows, but it's up there in those record-keeping moments. But for me personally, it was absolutely transformational. Because not since I was a trooper in the war on poverty, where we cut the poverty rate in half in 11 years, did I feel that I was really part of something historic and really important. And it's had me on fire ever since. So I wanted to share some of that excitement with you, this idea of a movement of movements. And to try to begin to show that to the world, our interns in our office, we created an online hub, which I want to tell you about. It's called Field Guide to the Democracy Movement. And because I want everyone to see that how all this is coming together, and we teamed up with an organization that is emblematic of this movement of movements. It's called the Democracy Initiative. And guess what? They have over 60 member organizations, from labor to the environment to racial justice, representing over 30 million Americans coming together on core democracy reforms. And so it's on this online hub, we have a map that's interactive. You can't tell that here, but to really show people the extent of democracy and democracy reforms that are dealing with the core questions of whose vote, who gets to vote, and whose money is determining the outcome. These are reforms. All of these states with the darkened color are states where there's a lot going on, and the darker the state, I'm proud of the state of Massachusetts, there is really dark, that they represent then democracy reforms that are building. And just to give you one example that I'm taken by is, I don't know how many of you followed Seattle's innovation. They call it democracy vouchers. So in certain races for city government, they give everyone who votes, they get 4 $25 vouchers. And they can assign those to whichever candidates they wish. And when they actually tried this, it really worked, because guess what? The people who accepted not private money, but they accepted the people's vouchers, they won their seats. And many more, of course, low-income people and even homeless people can participate in this. So it's a kind of breakthrough, and now I just learned this week that there's a bill being drafted in Congress to take this national. But there are dozens of system reforms that are being initiated across the entire country today. So, in closing, getting more personal, what is really required of us to be alive in this historic moment? And here's how Anna and I like to think about it, that it's a quality that we try to work on in ourselves, and that is the quality that we've seen in the people we most admire in the world, the quality of bold humility. And what does that mean? Well, the bold part means that we understand that in an era such as ours today, goodness may not any longer be the opposite of evil. Maybe today, courage is the opposite, because just being good is not enough. Goodness is not good enough, that we have to be willing to go out there, take risks for what we believe in, and that's the boldness comes in. And so several years ago, I kind of developed a cheesy gimmick that works for me that I will share with you, and that is I was in a situation where I had to speak out, and my heart starts going like this when I'm, like most of us, when we know we're going to differ from people in the room, and my heart was going like that. And I said, okay, Frankie, you're all about reframing. Just call it your inner applause going off. So as we become bold, in the bold humility, we can just reframe. Our pounding hearts are actually cheering us on. And that means we're doing exactly what we should be doing in this historic moment. Now, the humility part. The humility part is this, that given the EcoMind in which we know we're all connected, change is the only constant, and we're all co-creating, then guess what? Then we know that it's not possible to predict the future. That's one negative way of saying it. But to say it positively is that it's not possible to know what's possible. And to me, this is the most freeing line ever for me. Because if it's not possible to know what's possible, then I am free. I am free to go for what I really, really want. And that's the kind of spirit that I think is required of us today. And in that spirit, we do not have to be an optimist. We do not have, it doesn't pay to be a pessimist, but we're not required to be an optimist. We just have to recognize then that it's not possible to, and I actually call myself a possibilist. And my final thought is going back to this idea of courage and what is courage. I really want to underscore it because I feel it so alive in the students that I met here today, and I really want to honor you for this. That I want you all to understand that your courage in stepping out in all the ways you are on this campus, your courage is contagious. That's one of the great things about knowing that we're all in relation. When people see you stepping out of your comfort zone, taking a stand, creating what you're doing here, we heard about the Food Recovery Network, for example. That's what we mean by the kind of courage required today. And just know that it's contagious. I picked some up from you all, and we'll take it with us. And we are so delighted to have been asked to speak to you and just to absorb this wonderful campus. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. So I think Lindsay said there's time for questions. Yes. Do you have mics, or people should just?
I feel like I organized something like that.
Yes. Okay. We can also repeat questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm a historian, and so yes, that's often depressing. And I love the possibilist framework. I think that's going to really help work for me going forward. But I feel like it can be a lot easier to push back at media organizations than it can be to get historians involved in the conversation or to bring history to bear. So I'm struck constantly by the fact that John Deere and Dow DuPont and Monsanto are all corporate key sponsors of the Smithsonian's agricultural history exhibition building. And these are the main tools we have to reach out to the public too often. And yet in order to fund our precarious, yet I hope important and with the possibility transformative discipline of history.
Right.
So I was just wondering if you had any insight for how to respond to corporate influence, trying to shut out what I hope are important voices in the humanities, bringing these messages.
Right, that's a very good question. And I remember when I was writing my last book, it was on food and climate change. It was actually called Diet for a Hot Planet, with obvious homage to my mother. And I went to the exhibit at the Natural History Museum in New York City on climate change. And the only thing they mentioned about food in the whole exhibit was one little image, one tiny little image that said that maybe genetically engineered foods might be able to help us be more resilient to climate change, despite the fact that there has been the only commercialized genetically engineered crops on the planet today are really just essentially chemical to a chemical delivery system. They're either tolerant to herbicides or they're expressing an insecticide, and we know all around the world these incredible agroecological solutions that are creating resiliency in the fields. And I looked at, well, who's the corporate sponsors of such a display? And of course there are those corporate connections. And I think that your question, I think it's the question we could ask about media institutions, the question we could ask about museums, the questions we could ask about universities. It's how is the story being told of what our history is and what that means for our present. And I think this gets to why I've been really moved by the work that my mother and other colleagues have done around this kind of movement of movements question, which is no matter what you care about, what issue you care about, that we really need to be all thinking about how can we plug into fixing our democracy so that we are ensuring that we are blocking the corporate capture of our democratic institutions, of which media is one of the key institutions, right? And so that Field Guide to Democracy, I think, is a great place to look at what's happening in Delaware. Actually, when I was making these slides, I was thinking, oh, it'd be cool if I pull up Delaware. So people, it's like, well, there's 0 things happening in Delaware. But that means that possibility.
It could just mean we didn't
you
do
all in
enough
this
research.
room could start such a thing in Delaware. So I think that's how I would get to it. And actually, one of the I didn't talk about this work tonight, but one of the things that is like my personal fascinations is kind of how corporations are influencing both media institutions, like The Atlantic was one example, but how they're creating funding K through 12 education around food and farming, all of these different ways, which if somebody has a question, then I can talk about it more, but I'll stop there in my answer. I don't know if you want to add anything or want to take another question.
It's a great question. We don't pretend to have the answer for you, but I'll just tell you a story about my taking on Oxford University Press. Should I mention that?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, this is an example of a book called Food Politics, written by a Harvard professor, and Oxford University Press did not acknowledge this was that he had been an advisor to Monsanto, and there are no citations in the book. And the book is presented by Oxford University Press as a kind of even-handed overview where it's all you need, everything you need to know.
And say the author again. It's called it's Food Politics, not to be confused with Marion Nestle's.
Right, not to be
Food
confused with Marion Nestle's book. But anyway, and I'll never, I don't mean to tell a story just to say, oh, look what I did, but it's kind of like that. I decided I couldn't stand this, and so I wrote to Oxford University Press. And, it's the kind of thing you'll never know, the ripples, right? But they actually, I have in writing from them that they said that they don't think that books for students need to have citations. Anyway, I organized a petition campaign and got 5,000 signatures, and I actually took it to Oxford and hand-delivered it to Oxford University Press editor. And I have no idea whether that made any difference, but it was so on the surface, right? So they are the gold standard, right? So I think anything we can do, and I can say I can't claim that it had any effect. I still want to have somebody go back and see if there was any change after that in terms of at least including citations. But the point is we never know, we never know what something like that, what kind of conversations got started in the board of Oxford University Press, So I'm just saying that however, like a little gnat, a little fly on the elephant, you feel that again, you never know who's watching, you never know what ripples, you never know what internal things can. Anyway, I don't know if that helps, but and I think that the examples that Anna pointed to, that Twitter campaign. Mm-hmm. I mean, this was before Twitter. My Oxford University. Wait, if I'd had that going, that would have been great. But I think you know, it's about calling it out, you know, and having the you know, just regardless of, it's not possible to know what's possible attitude, right? And just see what the consequences could be, and then somebody else can say, oh, well, I could do this too, and speak out. So it's not a rah, rah, rah answer, but it's the spirit of what we're trying to say.
Other questions? Yeah.
Brianna, what do you see as some of the most promising developments in terms of communicating effectively, like from your perspective? Where is the most promise to reaching people and countering,
Right.
you know, the narratives that
Right.
that you see they're trapped in, but that people don't see?
Yeah, so the question was, where am I seeing the most promising examples of communications and messaging? And that is a really good question. And I think we're seeing it in a couple different ways, I think. And I think we're all really painfully aware of the hemorrhaging of our media institutions at this moment. And so by no means do I want to say this is like the heyday of media, because there is this dissolution in these media institutions. On the other hand, we're seeing for the first time really robust public interest, nonprofit, investigative journalism institutions. I would mention ProPublica, the Food and Environment Reporting Network that specifically looks at food. The Intercept is increasingly creating a food and ag beat. A nonprofit called Civil Eats, civileats.org. You know, so again, I think that we, at the same time, we don't want to take our eye off the ball of calling sort of more traditional media institutions to account and make sure that they're being fair and representing the story. At the same time, I think we do have these resources that didn't exist, say, 5-10 years ago, to do some of that deep investigative reporting that I think is really important. The second thing that I feel is really exciting to me is again, sort of best of times, worst of times, the emergence of you know, incredible television programming and documentary films that, again, I think can go longer form and tell more of that story. Of course, you know, the stories that I still think should be heard are not getting heard, but there's a lot of that. And then at Real Food Media, you know, I think for me, a great example of just how much hunger there is out there for news stories was we, for 3 years, ran an international films competition on short films under 4 minutes on food and farming. And when we launched this, everybody that I talked to was like, nice idea, Anna, but are you sure you're not just going to get a bunch of like hipsters in Brooklyn getting, you know, really excited about their kale, you know, growing in their backyard? You know, are you really going to get any content that's interesting? Now, of course, I knew from the work we'd done that there are incredible stories all around the world. I was pretty sure we were going to get some really interesting material. We ended up getting more than 500 submissions from more than 60 countries. We have 70 that we showcase at Real Food Films, at Real Food Media. We've had pop-up film festivals, 260 pop-up film festivals around the world that are showcasing these stories. And to me, it's an example of just how much storytelling hunger there is out there, and how many stories, you know, how many stories we can tell. So those are just some examples. But you know, to me, this is one of sort of the areas of work that I've found myself gravitating toward is not just how do we create critical consumers of food, but how do we create critical consumers of media about food? And that goes hand in hand, that media literacy piece, and really, you know, trying to think about how do you get young people to have that media literacy education so they know when they're being marketed to and advertised to, and they get outraged about it and they push back against it. So, but thanks for that question. Yeah.
So I want to speak a little bit more to this idea of scarcity, and not necessarily in the food system per se, because as you indicated, there's plenty of calories out there for everyone. But what's going to happen, or what do you believe could happen, or maybe potential solutions for other realms where scarcity is like the main narrative when you're talking about extractive industries and non-renewables and essentially like all other sectors of like water, kind of
Right.
mentioned the Ogallala and stuff like that. I mean, I just wanted to speak more to that because it all ties into the system and it's kind of
Yeah. So the question was about, going deeper into this idea of scarcity and beyond food, but looking at scarcity in terms of other extractive industries like and water, and wanting us to sort of explore a bit more about this idea of scarcity in those realms. Do you want to take it?
Yeah, I think the core or the most critical realization as I was writing World Hunger 10 Myths, where we took on a lot of the creation of scarcity themes in terms of the water, the overuse of water, and the destruction of soil quality, is that I was so incredibly struck by the power of the other pathway, the power of as Anna was talking about, agroecology soils, organic soils that actually hold the water more and don't pollute the water. And so I think just the more that we can emphasize, I think there's so much fear that let me put it this way, that without that corporate chemical approach to agriculture that people have been taught is so efficient and productive, without it, that people will starve, they can't possibly produce enough food. I don't know if this is getting at what your question was, but I think anything that we can do to show how incredibly productive, and now we have the evidence of this other pathway is, as well as reducing, healthcare costs and all, that we could state that in the positive, I think the better off we are. To always couple the critique of the SAD diet, and I love that acronym, with more and more evidence, and I'd be happy to offer the kinds of things that I use, say, in World Hunger 10 Myths, and in Anna's book, and that to really emphasize the possibilities opening and the delicious possibilities, and the way that that aligning with the rules of the laws of nature, there is more than enough for us going forward. So I don't know if I'm grasping your question, but that's one of the key themes anyway that I wanted to emphasize is not just it's certainly important to scare people, rightfully so, in terms of where we're headed, but also to underscore the productive potential and the health potential and all of the alternative.
Yeah.
So did you want to jump in, or did we get close to?
Definitely teasing it out for me, and I definitely appreciate you taking on that question because it's a big one.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I feel like there's a lot of parallels when I think about food and the energy sector, because, I would say that the way we've structured this industrial model, it is, by definition, it is an extractive industry, similar to the oil and gas sector now. And I've been really struck at the parallels, and one of my dear friends runs an organization called the Solutions Project, which is based, with their vision is 100% renewable for the 100% of the people, and they're looking at renewable energy. And they commissioned a study by a Stanford professor that looked at, what would it take? Do we have enough? There's a scarcity mindset when it comes to, of course, energy resources. Do we have enough in this country to go renewable? And of course, all the frack industry and the oil industry, we know the coal, they would all say, no, we don't. But this researcher looked at it and actually mapped out, yes, it would look different. The breakdown of renewables in California would look different than Wisconsin, would look different than Vermont. But state by state, he looked at what you would need to do and what was possible to go 100% renewable. And she and I have talked about, what would it look like to commission a team of academics to look at, what would it look like to go 100% renewable in food, to create that kind of abundance in this country? And of course, it is possible. It would radically, the Midwest would look really different, and we would probably be producing a lot more food that we actually eat, which would be a good thing. But I think it is about sort of creating that sense of possibility, which I think is so important, and getting people to see the extractive nature of our current food system, and I do think more and more people are getting that, but I think it's a constant battle against the scarcity myth. My mom mentioned this book, World Hunger 10 Myths. I highly recommend it to all of you if you haven't read it. Her first version of it was in the 1980s. It was called World Hunger 12 Myths, and I was like, great, Mom, you've gotten rid of 2 myths. She was like, well, no, we just consolidated them to 10. So those myths, that she's been fighting for 5 decades almost, are still out there, but I think it's part of our work to keep exposing them and to keep rewriting that story. So, other questions?
Yeah. That's a really positive note.
Oh, good, perfect.
That we'd be out of here at 7 o'clock.
Look at us, we're right on time.
I really like that we've just been tasked with this particular work. And so can we just thank Anna and Frankie again for being here?
Thank you so much.
And I would like to say Happy Mother's Day to my mother.
And I want to make a request to you all that please stay in touch with us. Please stay in touch, because I have really been so inspired by meeting people here, and I just feel like there's on the democracy work and the food, it's all the same, and I just want mutual inspiration. Yes. So thank you, and thank you for all you're doing.
Yeah, thanks everyone.